Dear ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, a real pleasure to do the warming up this morning on sustainability and be back among horticultural friends. Yeah, we'll zoom out a bit. You see flowers, you also, by the way, see a lot of boxes. I just moved house, so that's a little personal note. Yeah, let's look at why we are talking about sustainability at all and discuss where innovation can help and where it also often doesn't. Let me quickly introduce myself, a few more words than Jacques just said. I worked in many sectors with a lot of sustainability impact. In the first 5-6 years of my career, that was in business and technical roles, but in the last 20 years I focused on social and environmental impact in sectors, supply chains like timber, palm oil, coffee, cocoa tea, flowers and plants at MPS, and I recently joined this research agency, so now more in the cows and the vegetables. So it's an interesting broad view, and there are similarities always, but also of course differences. And it was very insightful to be able to work in the horticulture industry for the last years. So Tim said, okay, let's at least make sure that we understand why we're talking about sustainability here. And there are of course rational answers to that, but there are also personal answers. You know, what is it that you care about? Are you working on sustainability? If so, what is motivating you to do so? I think those are important questions. And don't forget, we're all animals, you know, children of evolution, like all the people around us and all the other life forms. But before I get too philosophical, let me point to this insightful research from the Stockholm Resilience Center. Some of you may know it. They have defined 9 planetary boundaries, and they've been doing research over the years of how are we affecting those planetary boundaries, you know, as a whole species, basically. You see here ozone, you see here ocean acidification, fresh water change, land system change, and of course CO2, climate change. So some of these are a bit more, need a little bit more explanation possibly, but I think a lot of them you will recognize. But the main thing here to point out is that we are crossing many of these boundaries, and we've crossed 6 of them, double as much as 15 years ago. And in the same period, human population went up from 6.9 billion to 8.1 billion, and it's probably growing to about 10. And there is a connection between the two, right? So you may also know the concept of donut economics, which actually takes this same principle, but then adds also some of the social aspects. So that may be interesting to look up online if you want. Yeah, there's a joke about 2 planets meeting in space. One asks the other how it's going. The other says, "I have a severe case of Homo sapiens." And the first says, "Well, don't worry, it will pass." And you can look at that in a more dark way, but also maybe in a good way, that we might be able to solve stuff in the end, right? Who knows? We can in a way see Earth as a superorganism. It can give energy, it can give resources, it can digest materials that we call waste or pollution. But of course there are limits to that. Like we shouldn't eat too much, like I did yesterday with a nice buffet. It's important not to think of the Earth in economic terms and project human constructs like annual pollution or emissions per person, because in the end, the Earth cares about, or the atmosphere, if you want, cares about what we do as a whole species over the years. As many of you may know, the CO2 that we blow into the atmosphere every year can stay there for centuries. So it's nice that we do a little bit less of emissions next year, but it's actually about the total we're blowing into the atmosphere. Yeah, so none of us can solve this by ourselves, but the question remains, what will you do? And one of the questions is, can we innovate ourselves out of this? How can we reverse these trends, and what's the role of innovation? Now, what I notice when we talk about innovation in agriculture and horticulture is that typically people tend to talk about technological innovation for productivity or efficiency. Kind of what I see is quite a narrow definition, but if you talk to people, then 80% of the cases, the discussion is about those kind of innovations. And yeah, I think it's important to look at it much more broadly, and at least innovation should also be aimed at social and environmental goals, and not only make use of technology, but also use biology and psychology. Now, this is not completely new for you. Of course, many of you are doing this in the greenhouses, but I think it's, you know, we have to check ourselves often, like, are we being too narrow in our thoughts? And I think it's important to stay and look really broadly. So some examples from horticulture that I found inspiring in recent years to see. This very nice looking sheep was just to say that we are using also now wool pellets in substrates. Maybe the substrate panel will talk about that. I don't know how big it is yet, but wool is very, very cheap in the Netherlands. They were looking at, should we just burn it? So these are nice ways to use it. There's geckos, there's also quails. Of course, there's beneficial insects in the greenhouses, but people are broadening what kind of biology can we use to address the pest pressure. On the right-hand side, on the bottom, there's the eDNA analysis, which was used recently by Dutch authorities to, when there was a lot of pollution in the water, they used the eDNA to find out, you know, which grower was behind that. So that's more in the compliance area, which is an innovation. Because of course, you know, if you do your best, but your neighbor is polluting, then, you know, that's a shame. So above that is the hanging banker plants. It's kind of Airbnb for your, you know, beneficial insects, and still saving space for your production. So that's an interesting one. Right on the top there is a communication campaign, and Frank van der Heijden may speak about it later. I don't know, but it's more on the communication side, trying to get consumers accustomed to having insects on the plants in the garden center. You know, often we would just spray everything so that everything is dead, but you know, then they put it in the garden and it's full of insects anyway. So you know, maybe we should educate a little bit more. And these are also kinds of innovation. Now in the middle, you may have seen photos before of Volterius, which produces translucent solar panels, which also move with the sun, so that you can actually optimize both the use of the sun for the plant growth and also for generating electricity. And at the bottom there in the middle is a machine which is using hot water to fight herbs, which is also interesting, you know, as opposed to either chemicals or laser. Apparently it uses much less energy than the laser solution. Let's see where I am in my story. So this is, I think it seems to be a little bit an old version, but the thing is, so the last example brings us into the realm of psychology and human behavior. Innovation needs both out-of-the-box and critical thinking. We all have preconceptions and thinking biases. I think that this is a super interesting area. Many books are written about it. And an example of that is wishful thinking. So one example of wishful thinking in horticulture, I would say, is to eliminate all chemical emissions by closing the greenhouse. Over the last years, I mean, I was also thinking, okay, conceptually that's interesting, but then you start to realize how there's also, you know, firstly the chemicals break down into other chemicals. Then some of the chemicals go out with the product or with the plant waste, or it goes into the sewer, but the sewer actually leaks into the ground. So there are so many, you know, pathways in which the emissions actually can come out. So if you don't put it in, it doesn't come out. So it's something to not be too wishful about. And there's all sorts of ways in which you know, the chemicals persist. I won't go into this too much. Maybe we talk about it later in the questions, but I think it's just important to check yourself. Is it wishful thinking? Are you really testing what you're doing? Another little caveat here is the Jevons paradox. I don't know if you know that one, but it's this is actually, the picture is a still from a Netflix documentary, By Now. A bit dark documentary, but worth watching. This is here the Eiffel Tower, and enormous amounts of trash that we are producing as humanity. And this is also about the Amazons and about basically us wanting to buy. The Jevons paradox is about how efficiency doesn't necessarily lead to less use of something. So he was about 160 years ago, he was living in England when there was coal, And as the efficiency of coal burning went up, he saw actually that the use also went up because people just started to use more coal. So that's the same with having all sorts of efficiency of, well, LED lights. You know, LED lights are more efficient, but then we make billboards of 50 by 50 meters in the city to use that light. You know, so and those are human behavior elements. So I think, yeah. So what do you do with that? Well, I would say, because otherwise it's kind of senseless knowledge. It's just you don't want to get depressed by this. The question is, what can you do with it? I think don't go for the cost and price leadership as your main strategy. You know, it's often not sustainable for your company, but it's certainly not sustainable for the planet. I think another interesting psychological pattern is the shifting baseline syndrome. I don't know who's heard of it. Is there any hands? Yeah. It's an interesting one. They call it also intergenerational memory loss, amnesia. Basically, people, apparently this has been researched. What you see here, by the way, is fish being caught in Florida in the 1950s, which is some huge fish, and a typical catch 50 years later is much smaller. Now, people apparently tend to think that nature is in a normal state when they were young. I don't know if that is something that you kind of recognize, but that when you were young, that's how probably nature was supposed to look like. But that happens every generation, you know. So it actually, we don't have a clue about the abundance of life that was there like 4 or 5 generations ago. That's what happens. So that also means that if we want to turn it around, we want to be much more ambitious than bringing it back to nature when you were a child. Just something to think about. And I think also that means that as generations, we need to every time, you know, strive for something better. So to close, some recommendations. I think, you know, you are entrepreneurs mostly. Of course, some in associations working with a lot of entrepreneurs. Stay curious. Find your own recipe in this whole sustainability journey. Use less fossil energy, less chemicals, less material resources. Pay and treat your people well, of course. So the innovation shouldn't be aimed at so much as the efficiency, but at the quality of the product and sustainability of the product. If we want to turn around those, you know, planetary boundary trends. The buyers and the breeders support the growers to reduce their impact, because that's where most of the impact is in the supply chain. Use certification not just as the check mark, use it to learn and improve. Work together in the supply chain, but also in pre-competitive alliances to solve the big issues, like the Floriculture Sustainability Initiative and more. Lobby for clear rules for the future. Don't lobby to hang on to the past. I think I see that too much, you know, that you think, hey, do you really? Examples of that are the European, you know, agricultural lobby, or in the Netherlands. There's so much hanging on to the past. But basically, I think that will just increase the shock at a later stage. And then shorten supply chains, because transport has significant impact in horticulture because of the volume of the product. And the phytosanitary rules lead to mandatory chemical use, which is sometimes a shame. We've seen at MPS sometimes huge usage of very toxic chemicals, but it was just because they had to do it to import into California, for instance, where, you know, something had to be sprayed. So if you stay a little bit closer to home, you will have less of those kind of problems. Finally, you are the green sector. That is so unique, and so try to make it true in all the ways you can imagine. Thank you.